Hi there. In this video, we will explore how we can use three method modifiers called before, after, and around to trigger an action before or after a method call and to modify the given method parameters. Alright, let's get started. The first modifier we're going to look at is called before. The before modifier allows us to wrap around our class method to invoke some functionality before the original method is called. Note that the return value of this wrapping function is ignored. Let's see this by example. So first what I'm going to do, I'm going to introduce a new subroutine, aka function, where we're getting the self, current instance as the first argument, and I'm going to get single argument, and I'm going to say that this argument I would expect name, and we get the argument from this global variable at underscore, and then I'm just simply going to say warn, calling test, and I'm just going to print out the name. So the before modifier itself, how you define the before modifier, you start with this keyword before, which accepts three things. It accepts a string with a method name, array ref with list of method names, or it can accept a regular expression. What I'm going to do, I'm going to use array ref, and I'm going to define that I would like to call before logic for test function, and I'm going to provide a subroutine that defines what logic I would like to execute. And what we're getting in this before modifier are two things. So first off, it's going to be the self, current instance, and then it's going to be the same args that we're going to be passing to the test function. So let's say that I would like to get all the arguments, and I'm just going to save them in args. And we get this again from the global args value. And I'm going to do this. I'm going to say my name shift the first argument from the args list, and then I'm going to throw an exception if the name equals a specific value. For example, I could say die name arg cannot be Joe, and I'm going to only do this if name is defined and name equals Joe. Alright, so we know that we don't get any return value, but I always like to be explicit, so I'm just going to say return undef here. And what we're going to do now is we're going to call this function in our human class. So we already have an instance from the human class stored in this human variable. So I'm going to say human test. So let's try to call it without any arguments, and let's see what we get. So Perl, and looks like we're getting warning, and we're getting warning because we're still printing the name, which is here in this test function, so that's fine. But we can see that we did not throw an exception when we call the test function. Now let's try to provide an argument, and let's say that this is Mark. Let's see what's going to happen now. Still nothing. It says that calling test function with value Mark. And now I'm going to change Mark to Joe, and if I save this, rerun the script, we're going to see that we actually threw an exception, which says name argument cannot be Joe. And this exception comes from this line. So the key takeaways here is that you can introduce some logic before your subroutines that you would like to execute, such as here where we're testing what was provided to this function, but also remember that the value that is being returned in this before modifier is ignored. Now let's look at the after modifier. It's very similar to the before modifier. However, the after functionality allows us to execute some logic after our method is called. The same as with before modifier, the return in the after wrapper is also ignored. And same as with the before modifier, it takes either string, list of function names, or regular expression. So just for sake of example, I'm going to change this to a simple string, which is going to be specific method name, which is our test function. And I'm going to say after. Now I'm going to leave the same logic, so that doesn't change. And let's try to call our test function again from our script. I'm going to go and change this name to Mark, and let's run our script. We're going to see that we're still calling the test, and we got Mark printed out. And what if I change this to Joe, save it, run the script? Now we're going to see that we did actually print out that we're calling the test function with the variable Joe, which comes from here. And afterwards, we can also see that we threw an exception, that the argument cannot be Joe. So that is the key difference. So before and after modifiers are pretty much the same, and the way how they function, the name is already implying that one modifier runs a logic before method is called, and the other modifier, which is the after logic, is called when the function has been run. Alright, so let's look at the around modifier. Now around is quite different from the previous modifiers. The around modifier receives the original method and the argument, allowing us to change the method execution flow. Now let's see what I mean by that. And before we start, again, the around modifier takes either string, a list of function names, or a regular expression. So just again, for sake of example, I'm going to first of all change this to around, and then I'm going to use a regular expression. Now you can do that by saying quote regex, and then we define the pattern of the method names we would like this logic to be executed for. Now in this case, it's only a single function for us, so I'm going to say test, and the around modifier doesn't really take the self context. It takes the original method name, which in our case would be test, then it takes the current self context, and then it takes the arguments that we're passing. So 3 things. Well, technically 2 things, which are always set in stone, which is the original method name and the current instance of self. And of course, arguments, as you know, you can pass as many arguments as you want. But we know that we're only going to be passing a single argument. So let's do this. I'm going to say that instead of actually throwing an exception, we can check that if a name equals to Joe, let's change it to something else, and then let's see what the test function prints out. I'm going to say name, oops, so it's going to be name equals new name if name is defined as a truthy value and if the name is Joe. So before we threw an exception if the name is Joe, but here we want to be helpful and just change the name to new name. And also the key difference is that we are actually returning functionality from the around modifier. So what we want to do instead, we're going to also execute the original method name. So this would be equivalent to just saying test, because you can't call method names using strings. We're just saying self context and original method name. And what we're going to pass in here is going to be the modified argument, which is the new name, if the name that we provided in the test function was value of Joe. All right, let's save this. Let's run our test script. I'm just going to clear this up and let's run it now. And maybe let's just change the Joe name to something else. So Mark, as we did before, and run the script. All right, so it says calling test function mark at human class, line 19. So this is still here. And now if I change this to Joe, save it up, run the script, we can see that we passed in the name Joe, but we actually printed out a new name. So this is because we wrapped around the test function, we received the original method name, the self context, and the arguments, and we checked if the first argument in the argument list was name Joe. And if it is, we override that with a new name. And what we return is a call to test function with a new argument, which is our overridden variable name that now holds a new name. So once we actually hit around the test function, the name that we set to Joe is no longer going to contain the original value. It's now going to hold the value of new name. I understand if this might be slightly confusing, but I encourage you to play around with these modifiers and experiment on your own, and I'm sure it's going to make a lot more sense. As for when you would want to use these modifiers, well, it always depends. You might never need to utilize this functionality, but it's good to know it's there. The before modifier can be useful to restrict some arguments being passed into function, or the after modifier can be used to do maybe some logging after you call a function, and the around modifier can be used to help the caller to implement the correct values in case the function was called incorrectly. But as I said, it really depends on the scenario. Alright, that's it for this video. We looked at before, after, and around modifiers, and we also explored when it might be useful to exercise this functionality. I hope you found this video useful, and I'll see you at the next one.